Difficult to know where to start because feminism is so many things to so many people, and it always has been. Some of what Jo is saying is, some of it I would agree with, some of it I've heard before. In the 1990s and 1980s and the late 70s, feminists were all hairy, man-hating lesbians, as opposed to all wanting liberation, or they were all for the elite rather than for the many, or they were everything that people didn't like if they were anti-feminist. I would never defend everything that's been done in the name of feminism, because there are some mad feminists as there are some mad anti-feminists. There are some extreme feminists, some extreme anti-feminists. But I think Jo has quite often trivialized very important issues. And I want to start by saying, by asking Jo, I'm assuming when you're saying that women have made this enormous progress, you're talking about women in Western societies, specifically British society, particularly elite women, white women, mainly in British society. You're not talking about all women in the world, or even all women in Britain. And many of the feminists I know are working in trade unions, they're working in women's refuges, they're more hands-on with, quote, ordinary women. They're not writing for The Guardian. In terms of the gains that women have made, most of your examples, I think, were gains that have been made by pretty privileged women. If you look at less privileged women, you get a rather different picture. If you look at apprentices, the earnings gap between apprentices, working class kids starting out in life, more working class than those that are going on to university in general, is last year female apprentices earned 21% less than male apprentices. Quite a big gender gap. Now that doesn't mean that girls and boys, young men and women in the same sector were paid differently. It's that men and women, girls and boys generally do not work in the same jobs. They go into different sectors. And women in particular choose really trivial things like hairdressing and childcare. And very often when women complain, or feminists complain, that women are being paid less than men, critics of feminism say, well, it's women's own fault. They choose things like childcare, which are badly paid. To which I would say, why is childcare badly paid? It's not because there's a shortage, because there's a surplus of people wanting to do it. There's a crisis in childcare. There's a crisis in social care for older people. This is traditionally women's work. It is badly paid work. In adult social care, a lot of it is part-time, a lot of it is very badly paid. And it's badly paid for men that do it, because it's traditionally women's work, as well as for women that do it. My own son works as an adult social care worker, and it is not well paid. I mustn't start talking about my son, because last time I spoke to him half an hour ago, he was in the Labour ward with his partner, so I don't know what the result of that is. She does the same sector, so they're struggling. Some women have not progressed in recent years. The impact of austerity has disproportionately fallen on women. There have been changes to the tax and benefit system, cuts to public services, including, of course, the NHS. Women are disproportionately affected as workers in these areas. They're also disproportionately affected as users of services or users on behalf of their family. So not always, of course, but very often, if a family member needs care, an elder person needs care, it's the women in the family that sort it out. And the cliche is, a good son makes sure his mother's well looked after in her old age. A good daughter looks after her mother in their old age. I think what's changed is that good daughters now have to do the job of sorting it all out, not necessarily doing it themselves, although many still do. 2010, Osborne's first budget, the emergency budget, you had to cut public spending. Women paid for 72% of the savings made. It wasn't the women that caused the crisis, but it was them that paid the price. And House of Commons library figures show that by 2020, 86% of the savings will have come from women. It's got worse since the coalition government became a Conservative government. And the biggest drop in living standards has been in female-headed households. So when you tell women who are dependent on benefits or who are in very badly paid work that you've never had it so good, they might disagree. And trying to think where to go next. It's very difficult replying to something when you've only just heard the account. On the generational issue, I don't see it as a generational issue. My friends of my own age, we disagree amongst ourselves. A lot of us have said, I wish Me Too had been around when I was young, when I thought it was the only one that these things happened to, and I didn't know what to do. Now people can put a name to bad behaviour, they can identify it, and sometimes it goes too far. Obviously, it sometimes goes too far, and trivial issues are inflated. And a lot of the things that I experienced when I was young, including walking down the road at night in London, thinking, oh, I'm independent, and then thinking, oh, I wish I hadn't done that, and had some pretty nasty experiences with the police involved. That's serious. But we didn't have a name for things. I thought I was the only person that got groped on the tube. And then I discovered, years later, talking about it with my friends, because none of us told each other. It has happened to all of us. We didn't like travelling in the rush hour tube in London. Well, we didn't tell each other why. We just thought we were a bit claustrophobic, and I wasn't the only one that was a bit claustrophobic. It was these things were happening. And some of the things were trivial, and it's a bit like, well, you bat away the flies. But it'd be ever so nice if you could walk around without the flies being there, and you didn't have to bat them away. So trivial things can be cumulative, and I think they can, if you let trivial things slide, they're part of an atmosphere, and they can become part of a continuum. It really hit me when I went out, a while ago now, because my daughter's 40, but when she was about in her late teens, and I went out with her one night to the theatre. Walking back through Manchester, there were lots of drunks, and the comments and the sexual, verbal assaults on her, I was appalled at, because I'd forgotten about it, because it wasn't happening to me in the same ways it had when I was young. I'd kind of forgotten about it. And she was saying, oh, Mum, don't make a fuss about it, but it's not nice. And it'd be much nicer if that kind of thing didn't happen. So I don't know if you think there is a problem with a lot of men's attitudes to women and a lot of other men's, perhaps, attitudes that it doesn't matter, or whether you think, well, flies are around, we have just bat them away, it doesn't actually matter. And I don't think, as I say, I don't think it's generational. My friends are divided. My age, my daughter calls herself a feminist now. When she was younger, she said, I'm not a feminist. Feminists are all fat, hairy lesbians. I said, I'm one. She said, oh, not you, Mum. Not you and your friends. No, you're not. But all the rest are. Well, that was my daughter. But she now thinks very much as I do. And I haven't been brainwashing her. She just lived through some things and had some bad experiences and changed her mind on some things. Perhaps we better open this up.
Okay, I will do, yeah. So,
I'm liable to go on too long.
If you want to come back in a bit on
of course.
anything. So, right.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much. Just a question to Valerie. Part of the gender pay gap presents itself after the marriage, and it has to do with the fact that the two partners do not have equal responsibilities. But up to what point is this also responsibility for a woman not to pick someone as a partner who is not willing to share these responsibilities? specifically now that we know all these stats and we know that this is the case. So where is there such a thing as a responsibility to say, look, if we're going to be together, it's going to be 50-50, otherwise, I'm not marrying you, or goodbye.
Thanks. Joe, it's a question for you. I think you picked very trivial examples when you wanted to say how much progress women have made, and so then talking about the hand on the knee and so on. I think your attack there should be at the media, that the media sees that as more serious than the Rotherham girls, rather than at feminists themselves. And I wonder why you didn't, for example, talk about domestic violence and the statistics on domestic violence, and that 1 in 4 women still experience domestic violence, that 75% of domestic violence is male on female, and even in cases of male domestic violence, men experiencing domestic violence, over 50% of that is carried out by men too. So I just wondered if you could say something about that.
Yeah, I would just echo that some of the comments, the examples were quite trivial. It was only 1994 when married women had the right to refuse sex from their partner and to say that it was rape. And there's the onset of social media, which the contemporary youth today, we didn't have that back in the time, and that plays a massive, massive part. Have you heard of the Steubenville case? Yeah, it's not an isolated case. So that girl was not just raped by that group of men, it was witnessed by the entire world, and that's not an isolated case. Me Too came on the back of some very courageous women telling their story, and I think what you just said really belittled that. Yes, there were hangers-on, but the actual fundamentals of that movement, it takes a lot of guts for women to come out and tell their experience like that.
I don't particularly have any constructive question to you. I'm just wanting to point out that sexual harassment is about unwanted sexual attention. So it isn't difficult to define what's sexual harassment at all. If you have looked at the criminal law definitions, it's not difficult at all. And everyone should be aware that if a woman says no, it means no. It's as simple as that, really.
Thank you. Just going on the back of that, about going back to the continuum, which it felt like you sort of said that kissing and hugging could be on the same sort of continuum as maybe a touch on the knee, and I felt that sort of ignored consent. And kissing and hugging, generally you do have that sort of consent, and it's sort of a two-way thing, and there isn't consent around touching knees, and that maybe can lead to a culture where rape can become more acceptable.
Cool.
So it's a question for Joanna. So you mentioned about everyday sexism, you use that term. So I've got two questions. One question is, do you believe that everyday sexism doesn't exist? And two, you mentioned a lot that women have never had it so better than what they've got it now. Well, why do we have to use that word better? Why can't it be women have never had it? You know, why can't it be women have never had it so equal? Why do we have to settle for better? Why can't it be, you know, the same? Why does it have to just be, oh, we've had it better, not quite as good as men, but it's better? Why do we have to settle for that and like stop moaning because it's better? Why can't it be it's the same as men now? So you have nothing to moan about. And I think some of the points like other people have said kind of does trivialise that and just kind of settle for better. And I think the Me Too movement kind of, it's good that it's been in the media and it's heightened that, and it means that women aren't just settling for being better than in the past anymore.
Kind of going in reverse order, if you like, I think that's a very important point that you make about why settle for just better than it's ever been. You know, well, one of the reasons why I say better rather than equal is because in some very important measures, women are not just doing better than ever before, but are not equal, are doing better. So, I mean, it would be a lie to say that women are equal to men in higher education. They're doing way better than men. If you look at, as I said, entry into significant areas of the professions, women are not just doing better than ever before. You know, if you look at, say, the number of vets, there are 78% of vets today are women. You know, so it's not that we're doing better, and it's not that we're equal in some areas, and I agree with you, not all areas, but in some areas, we are doing better than men, not just better than historically. On the other questions, why didn't I use the example of domestic violence? I could have done. Domestic violence, I think, is a complicated issue because a lot of these issues, there are no definitions have changed over time. So we have new legislation around domestic violence that has shifted the definition away from physical abuse and into the terrain of the psychological. So we could, when we try to make comparative analyses over time, we're not comparing like with like. The definition of domestic violence has changed. On some statistics, rates of domestic violence have come down. Domestic violence has gone down in recent years, and one of the reasons why it's gone down, thankfully, is because women are no longer, not all women, and I'm not naive, I completely understand and acknowledge that domestic violence does exist, that it does take place, but thankfully more women are not in positions of economic dependence upon men. Not as many women are in positions of economic dependence upon men as were in the past, so more women are able to get themselves out of violent and abusive situations. So on some accounts, by some statistics, rates of domestic violence have come down. One of the problems with definition, when we try and get some proper analysis of what's going on here, and I think the woman who spoke over there actually put it very, very nicely, that the definition of sexual harassment has become unwanted behaviour. But obviously there's a huge problem with defining harassment as unwanted behaviour, because what might be unwanted to me might not be unwanted to somebody else. It's not an objective. To describe something as unwanted is not an objective. I mean, if we take murder or beating someone, these are objective events that have taken place. When we move into the terrain of the unwanted, we're in the terrain of the subjective. Who can know what is unwanted to different people?
If you're not sure, don't do it.
Self-determination and I have control over my body, you have control over yours. It's all about that. It's not difficult at all. Not difficult.
But if you're walking down the street and someone whistles at you, there is no way that that person who is whistling can know in advance whether that whistle is going to be wanted or unwanted. So the solution might be that men could go up to women in the street and say, "Excuse me, would you mind awfully if I whistled at you?" Somebody could go up and say, "Would you mind if I whistled at you?"
Don't men have any responsibility for anything? Everything's going on women, that it's you're trivialising or it's the definition. What about men having in your argument, some responsibility to ask and behave differently and read and say, lots of women don't like being whistled at. Maybe I won't whistle at the next woman because she might not like it.
Yeah.
How about that?
Well, one problem with this is that lots of women don't like being spoken to randomly in the street. So going up to somebody and randomly asking, "Would you mind if I was to do this?" might in and of itself be a form of harassment. But personally, I do not want to live in a world where behaviour is so policed and so regulated that informal interactions between people cannot take place in a spontaneous way. I would far rather risk a whistle than live in a world where people were so conscious of regulating their own behaviour that people did not feel able to relate and interact with each other in that way. A final comment, you know, because everybody's kicking off. On the Me Too and the Harvey Weinstein, you know, I'm certainly not going to sit here and defend Harvey Weinstein. I would love to see him appear in a court of law and to see some of the allegations put against him actually be tested and for him to be sentenced if found guilty, and for this to be played out in courts rather than in the pages of newspapers. But actually, you know, I dispute, and everyone's going to hate me even more for saying this, I dispute the idea that these women were courageous and brave in coming forward. They've come forward to huge praise, recognition, applause for their bravery, affirmation. You know, it was a pretty safe bet. And I think what that represents nowadays is not just the shift in power, that women have more power in society today, but that the currency of what gives you power has shifted. So 10 years ago, the women, and I know everybody says this is a trivial example, but believe me, this is the one that made the newspaper headlines. This is the one that brought down a government minister. You know, 10 years ago, women journalists could have long, flirtatious lunches and make newspaper columns out of those lunches. That was what gave women power 10 years ago. That was the currency. Let's get some gossip from what was going on in Westminster. Today, the currency becomes their own displays of victimhood, their own statements of personal suffering. So women have got more power at the exact time of what it means to be powerful has changed. Power today, and by power I mean platforms, the moral high ground, newspaper column inches, status in society, comes with victimhood. And women have risen into powerful positions at the same time that being powerful comes with victimhood. And so I don't think those women were terribly brave, and I'm not going to applaud them. I think there are people who are very, very brave. I think some of the American gymnasts who took their coach to court and saw him sentenced for his crime, I think those gymnasts were incredibly brave, and I would completely take my hat off to them. I think spilling all in a newspaper column for publicity does not necessarily make you brave.
Valerie?
Continuing the theme of sexual harassment, but looking at it in the workplace, where men have often said they don't know what's acceptable anymore, the best answer I've come across is, would you do it to your boss? And if you wouldn't put your hand on your boss's knee, then don't do it to that junior person in the office. Because it is a power thing, or it's linked to hierarchies. Again, in terms of looking at the employment, you took the example of women becoming vets, women succeeding in a well-paid profession. But what about the badly paid, important work that women do, or the unpaid work that women do that is not valued? And I'll return to childcare. I can't think of anything more important than bringing up the next generation of citizens. And sometimes it's done for free in the home, and sometimes it's done by paid workers. And in my experience, it's hard work. It's difficult work, and it should be well-paid work. It should be properly valued. And then perhaps more men would do it as well, and children would get male role models as well as female role models, and things could move on, be very different. Replying to the man who, the only question that was to me directly, what would I say to, it was women who should only marry or get together with men who are prepared to do 50% of the housework and share the child rearing, etc. There aren't that many men around like that. I used to have these discussions with groups of students, and the young women would say, well, I'm only going to marry someone that will do X, Y, and Z. And the young men would say, eh? No way, I want a wife. I want someone that's going to do these things. I don't want to have to still do it if I've got a wife. I don't think there's that many men around. And of course then there's a problem of women not getting married, not having children, and a declining birth rate. Seen as an extreme example in Japan, where the men work extremely long hours and do virtually no housework at all. Women are opting out of marriage and relationships with men because they're a bit impossible sometimes.
Okay, right, we will take another round of questions and comments. Hey, they're all going up now.
Joe, with regard to the three issues that you focused on, so one was liberation, another one was social class, and the other one was victimhood. With the first of those, you said that contemporary feminists seem to have abandoned the older notion of women's liberation. But then from other things that you said, I wondered whether you thought it was right to abandon that, or did I misunderstand? So do you think that the notion of liberation ought to be sort of reclaimed, reused, reappropriated by contemporary feminists, or dropped altogether?
With regards to men, obviously everybody giggled, you know, when you were speaking about men not doing housework or whatever. Where's rights for men in it? Because obviously I understand it's feminism. You never see changing tables for babies in men's bathrooms. Men don't have maternity pay, obviously paternity pay like women do. You never really see males working in childcare because there is a stigma around it. Things like that. If men were given more opportunities, do you not think they'd be a bit more receptive to women having the same opportunities as them? As well, like courts, automatically now rights go to women. Women, you know, get the child. So I feel like, do you not see that as being a bit of an issue?
I think that Jo mentioned during her initial decision about how or alluded to that it's sort of feminism is against men, and I really don't think it is, and I think that a lot of feminism does actually want to put us on level playing fields, so try to like move away from gendered toys and gendered education, so lots of women going into like caring roles because of them maybe studying stuff that is less sort of STEM based, so they're going to be like moving on to careers that are better paid, and so I just think that a lot of what feminism does talk about is trying to like bring the balance so that men do have the opportunity to maybe like sort of feel more comfortable with the like more caring side of their characters, and it isn't about versus sort of thing. It's not about against them.
I just wanted to say I don't think you've answered Val's questions about class, Jo, and the fact that the examples you've given about women being in a better position are largely for women, elite women.
Yes, well, we've heard the word patriarchy mentioned a few times, but the thing is, there are different cultures which have different forms of patriarchy. Now, it seems to me that kind of, apart from a couple of politically correct, veiled comments, it's all been implicitly directed towards white men. Now, I'm fairly certain white, native, Christian background men, but it's quite clear to me that the occasional comments which have come up about Rochdale and Rotherham, and I don't think the word Telford's been mentioned this evening, there is a demographic, and we know what it is, it's the demographic of Islam, where there is a very different type of patriarchy, which is responsible for things like female genital mutilation. Now, I would say if I get some kind of comment from a man on the street, I would much rather laugh it off than have to suffer having my tongue nailed to a table, or being threatened to be burnt with lighter fluid, or be genitally mutilated. And I'm really concerned that the discussion about feminism by feminists discreetly ignores what is, to me, a far, far bigger problem than anything to do with the way that some white man at the BBC or in Parliament might have, you know, just touched someone on the knee or something. So I think that's a very important point, and I'm kind of disappointed that it hasn't been addressed so far.
This is kind of a question directed at both of you. Women currently make up 51% of the population, but are only represented by 32% in Parliament. And obviously at the beginning, Joe, you were talking about sort of women being in positions of power, like Prime Minister and Scotland's First Minister. However, would you say that women, just because they're in positions of power, does not mean they are in more power? So, like the headlines of newspapers like the Daily Mail, that while in a serious discussion that Theresa May and Nicola Sturgeon were having, focused on the fact they were wearing skirts, not the fact they were discussing Brexit. Would you say that that doesn't mean that, that means that women, no matter how powerful they get, they're still in those positions? And then you get things like the presidential election, where both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were accused of things that were illegal. Hillary Clinton's more sort of fraud than, and then Donald Trump more sexual harassment, and that was completely ignored by the papers. Are women in politics particularly targeted because they are women, and because she was a woman and she made that error that people like Mike Pence have also done, but it was completely ignored? Is that because they are women in positions of power?
I think that is a very binary, I have a very binary view of whether you are a victim or you are liberated. There is nothing in the middle where you can call out inequality and not be a victim. So it's like, and for example, the Me Too movement, you were only groped, don't be a victim. Oh, you were raped, then you have the right. And let's not forget that those gymnasts were given validity by the Me Too movement. And also, it's interesting that you call feminists privileged. There is a lot of non-privileged feminists going on, but they may not have that much interest by the media. That doesn't mean they don't exist, including women of color. And at the same time, I think it's very interesting because I don't think nobody that is not privileged would publish a book saying, we have all it so good, let's just enjoy it. And it's important to recognize you are unprivileged. And yeah.
Going on to the lady's point where she's talking about female genital mutilation, I don't think that was brought up because I believe the book's more about Western feminism, and Valerie mentioned that you're talking about British feminism, and that isn't a procedure that happens here, thankfully. And I think to trivialise it, well, not, yeah, it's the UK, it's a much bigger issue, surely everyone agrees. In other countries that are less affluent countries, it's not a massive problem. In the UK, we'll just think why both ladies didn't mention it. And I think to say that feminists care more about, you know, a touch on the knee here or a wolf whistle in comparison to such a horrific situation like female genital mutilation just brings all feminists under this thing that we only care about, you know, the jokes and, you know, we hate men, and that we don't care about these much bigger issues that affect, you know, women all over the world. And I just feel like moaning about one thing kind of just doesn't mean that you don't think about the other things, doesn't mean you don't care about those things, they just aren't happening to you. And, you know, this is the talk that's focused on the things that happen to people here.
Okay, first of all, just it's very interesting listening to all the different elements of the debate, and it's really got me thinking. It's also got my heart beating a little faster knowing I have to stand up and talk. It gets the adrenaline going a little bit, doesn't it, all these different points of view. And I do want to say that the first speaker to me touched on what's most important, because to me modern feminism is superficial and petty a lot of the time, and a lot of their arguments are on social media and take place in what is effectively a very, very large echo chamber, and people vacillate very quickly from one thing to another, and the criticisms quickly become almost shrill, you know, and deafening. If I could just finish, I've listened to everybody tonight, and I do want to listen to you again, but just now that I'm doing this, if you'll just let me speak. Because if you look at, say, 50 or 100 years ago, what suffragettes were doing, it was a different ball game altogether, and they were planting bombs even for women's rights and training up people like as militia movements in East London parks and everything, quite serious things, you know. And they were talking about really, really big concepts and big issues like freedom and free speech and democracy and tolerance, and there seems to be less use of these, you know, this vocabulary now in modern discussions, and I find that really fascinating. And I almost yearn for a Women for Democracy movement in the face of the House of Lords, you know, turning around and saying the people's democratic vote should be reversed, or in the face of an elite EU telling us that ordinary people, you know, are not fit to make decisions and they're against popular movements and everything like that. So I do sort of agree with the first speaker a lot in seeing what I see as an increasing move to cultural and behavioural and attitudinal things rather than issues that should matter a lot more than they do now.
Can I just come back on the lady who says about genital mutilation, because she said that it was not a major issue. It's taking place at the rate of about once an hour, and it's been illegal for over, I don't know, so 2 decades or something, and yet one single person has ever been prosecuted for it in this country. So I would contest what that lady said.
Okay, thank you. I want to spend most time talking about working class women and jobs, because you're absolutely right. I didn't get a chance to come back on what Valerie was saying in the first round. I hope, or one of the things that I really hoped I'd done in my initial introduction was to really focus on this issue of social class and to really spell out that I think that there are social class differences today. I think there are real and genuine existing social class differences between the experiences of working class women and the experiences of middle class women. And I don't know how I could have made that clearer. I thought I'd said that kind of a lot. But if I hadn't said it a lot, I want to say it again now. I think there are huge differences between the experiences of working class women and middle class women. I think feminism today, however, speaks to and responds to the experiences of middle class women. I do think that working class men and working class women have more in common with each other and are better off fighting for their interests alongside each other rather than pitched against each other. And I think as part of that, we do need to recognise the changes that have taken place, not in feminism for one moment, but the changes that have actually taken place in the labour market in this country over recent decades that I think have had a major and fundamental structural impact upon the whole of society. So if you will bear with me for 1 minute, and I don't do this often, but I kind of feel the need to this evening, just to personalise this for 1 second. So I grew up not a million miles away from here. I'm from Middlesbrough. So I was born in Middlesbrough, end of 1973. I'm the eldest of 5 children. Both my parents left school at age 14, 15 without any qualifications. My father worked as a labourer, first of all for British Steel, Redcar, which I'm sure many of you here will be familiar with, later for British Rail. Obviously, there comes a point when you've got 5 children where working as a labourer doesn't give you enough money to support 5 children. So at that point, my father stopped working, which was kind of good because Margaret Thatcher, I'm sure you're aware, was Prime Minister by the time we hit the late 1970s, going into the 1980s, and all of these industries were closing down. So my father became unemployed. You could argue it was a choice, you could argue he was put out of work. So from the age of 10, my father was out of work. My mother, at that point, not unlike a lot of women of her time, started to look for work. And my family, I'm not saying this to kind of say how special and unique I am. In fact, I'm saying it for completely the opposite reason. Me, growing up in Middlesbrough at that time, that was a completely common experience. All my friends' fathers were losing their jobs as well. The industry, the industrial heartlands around Middlesbrough were being completely devastated at that time. You name any major industry that men without qualifications worked in, and it was closing down. Some men retrained, my uncle, got jobs working in supermarkets or in warehouses. Often it was the women who went to work, who worked in shops or in care work or childcare. Now, I think one thing that's happened, and I think this is really interesting to go back to what I was saying earlier on about education and higher education in particular. If you look at the increase that's happened over recent years in women going to university and the fact that women have been outnumbering numbering men at university for, like I say, a quarter of a century, when the growth of the women students first took off in the 1960s and in the 1970s, there was a kind of cliched joke that did the rounds at that time, that widening participation in higher education meant that the doctor's daughter got to go to university as well as the doctor's son. In the 1990s, up to today, that's changed. And if you look at working class participation rates in higher education, actually a far greater proportion, and I'm not saying it's equal by any stretch, but if you look at higher education broken down by both gender and socioeconomic background, more working class girls go to university than working class boys. The change in the labour market means that there are more opportunities for women with low levels of education, or more opportunities for girls to get on in education, and more opportunities for women with low levels of education to take jobs. So what I'm saying, to be very, very blunt about it, is the new industries, the new businesses that have replaced British Steel, that have replaced coal mining, are call centres and warehouses. And call centres and warehouses tend to employ women rather than men. We can ask why. Are women more obedient? Are they cheaper? Are they more compliant? Are they less likely to be trade unionised? We can ask all kinds of questions about why, but the fact is that more women are employed in these sectors. It's easier to find a job for a working class woman nowadays. So this is where my references to better come into play. So I think it's really important that when we discuss the position of women today, we do it with a proper understanding of the changes that have taken place in the labour market. I want to just make one very, very final point, coming back to this issue of liberation, something that Paul touched upon, and somebody else was raising the issue, a couple of other people have raised the issue of vocabulary, and do we need to kind of reclaim liberation today? There's part of me kind of wishes yes and would like to claim liberation, but sadly I think it's lost all meaning. Unfortunately, liberation is a word that I hear quite often nowadays. Most universities have actually, student unions have actually set up liberation officers nowadays. I'm sure at Leeds University there are possibly liberation officers, and these tend to be for particular identity groups. And the role of the liberation officer, it seems to me, is to kind of confirm identity, or to make a bid for recognition of different groups, to make different groups visible on campus. That's not my idea of liberation. My idea of liberation comes back much more to what the chap over there was saying, to do with free speech, to do with free expression, to do with freedom of movement, freedom of association, democracy, exactly. All of these were really hard fought for freedoms, not just by the working class. And I think one thing that's overlooked in all the celebrations this year about the centenary of votes for women is that this was also the centenary of working class men getting the vote. I think when we overlook the important freedoms, how hard won these freedoms were, not just for the working class, but for women as a whole, to have these freedoms, we sacrifice them in the name of protection. And to put it starkly, that's our choice. Do we want protections put in place, or do we want freedom? And my choice would be for freedom every time, every time. A final comment on FGM, which I know is going to be very, very controversial. I don't think I think FGM is overstated as a problem in this country today. Sorry, but I think not one single... Not exactly, so we say no one has been convicted because we haven't actually found... So we're kind of assuming there's an invisible tide of FGM that we can't actually see or identify.
One an hour.
In this country. 1 in 10 women who've had it happen.
Okay, well, probably it was a mistake for me to raise this one right at the very, very end.
Well, that was the point I was making. Was that was not the only part of my question. Part of my question is there is a patriarchy which is far more terrifying than the white European patriarchy. And it's a patriarchy which is trying to take us over, and FGM is just one part of it.
I'm very, very nervous about saying that. Things like 1 an hour FGM, I'm afraid I would really doubt and call into question those statistics. I think any crime that we can't see, that we're going to make claims about on the basis of not having found evidence, sets alarm bells ringing in my head, I'm afraid.
Hang on. Valerie?
Okay.
Probably one final round of questions after Valerie's had a chance to come back.
Right, I'm one of those feminists that do use the word patriarchy, but I never call it the patriarchy. I don't know where that kind of crept in, because it implies it's like the capitalism. I mean, there's lots of different kinds of patriarchy, degrees of patriarchy, and calling it the patriarchy seems to imply that men are somehow consciously conspiring to keep women down and all men are benefiting and all women are oppressed, which is evidently not the case. So I think it's very useful to talk about patriarchy because it shows the connections between different forms of inequality and oppression, some of which are much worse than others, to the extent, and I don't know the figures, that FGM takes place anywhere in the world, particularly of children, then of course that is appalling. There's issues around whether adult women can freely consent to it, in the same way as there are issues around whether adult white Western women can freely consent to vaginal cosmetic surgery, which is apparently massively increasing. And that's to do with pornography and the rise of pornography, which we haven't yet, the internet pornography, which we haven't talked about yet, which is a frightening world for our children, and in my case grandchildren, to be growing up in, the kind of images that they're going to be surrounded by. There was a question somewhere over there, I can't remember who it was now, asking about rights for men, particularly things like parental leave for men, and I think that is really important. First of all, I think it's the second stage of feminism. The first stage was for women to get the same rights as men. And to the extent that women could behave like men, then they could succeed like men. They could go into the workplace and they could pretend they were men. And if they did something inconvenient like having children, they got someone else to look after them. They could be like men. But the second stage is to say, well, women are not a peculiar minority group in society. People who have children are not a peculiar minority group. Men have children as well. Men have responsibilities to bring up children as well as simply provide for their children. And increasingly younger men say they want to spend more time with their families. They want to be more active dads, and they might talk about their own fathers as being remote and not involved. So I think men have been in power political power for a very long time. They could have legislated to bring in paternity leave quite a long time ago. Britain got paternity a week's paternity leave when Tony Blair came into Parliament. It was the European legislation which Maastricht, the chapters, whatever it was, social chapter of the Maastricht Treaty, which Tony Blair, which had been blocked by the Tories, and Tony Blair signed, and we got, for the first time, men had a right for time off work when they had children. So women need men to have these rights. If women want men to share equally in the childcare, they obviously need men to be able to share equally in the childcare. I think that's the second stage of feminism. It's not just getting equality with men on the existing terms, it's actually changing the terms to say that we all need a society in which we can take time off to care for our elderly father or our young children without being penalised, rather than working ridiculously long hours, which the women that Joe's talked about a lot, the successful women, are going into very highly pressurised occupations, and other women are, on the whole, looking after their children, sometimes migrating from other side of the world and abandoning their own children to look after children in the West. So there's yes, men need some of the rights that women have gained. I think, yes, somebody asked about the women in Parliament and in the American elections getting targeted by the media. I think, yes, they do. Women are still unusual and they still get treated differently. I think they're not the same. They're not treated the same. And in terms of liberation, I think historically, going back to when I was young, the women's liberation movement was not the equal rights movement. It wasn't the movement that was asking for equal pay and a right to maternity leave. Women's liberation movement was much more radical. It was talking about sexual freedoms. It was talking about the freedom to love other women as well as loving men. It was talking about patriarchy, and it was talking about men as oppressors. So it seems odd that you're wanting to use the term, and freedom is such a woolly word. It can be precise, but I don't really know what it means to be free. Free of what? Free of responsibilities? We shouldn't be free of responsibilities as human beings, as in part of society.
Would you not say that media platforms have given women the empowerment to speak out? And I'm thinking specifically about the victims of Jimmy Savile, who felt that they could not speak out. They did go to the BBC, his employer, they did go to the police, they were disregarded, but they didn't feel empowered enough to speak out until after he died. And yet you say you cannot admire the women who came out about Harvey Weinstein in the media, but that was the only platform that they had, because again they tried to report him and got nowhere with it.
Thanks. Just to follow up on the point about domestic abuse, you said the numbers are coming down. That's great, but they're still terrible. Can't we both celebrate the successes, the victories, and still fight for better equality? Like, women are still fighting for freedom of speech, because on Twitter they get rape threats and death threats. There are more women at university, but when they get there, they experience sexual assault. So I think we need to both celebrate the successes, but still fight for all these ways in which women are discriminated against and are abused.
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out a few things about, I noticed, this is a question to Joanna, you said something about the lowest paid workers in this country paying the equal amount of money. Do you think it's worth celebrating that fact? I don't think so, because obviously we have more in work poverty in this country than ever. We have we have 1 million people working on 0-hour contracts, majority of whom are young women, according to the statistics of National Office of National Statistics. So I don't think that those are worth actually celebrating. If you were to make that comment, I think you should actually criticize it. And the demands for equal pay, you also said, oh yeah, that's a wonderful thing. It hasn't materialized. We still have to wait 120 years, according to some estimations, to achieve gender pay equality. What's your response to that?
86% of the austerity cuts have fallen on women. So to say that men and women on lowest paid jobs are equal is not true, because 86% of austerity cuts have fallen on women.
So I'd like to ask Jo what she's trying to achieve. Is she campaigning for something, or is it just a controversial analysis?
She's
No, yeah.
Okay. Do you think that? Sorry. Do you think modern feminism is damaging relationships between men and women? I find, as you do, the sort of a whole idea of policing the way people behave with each other is going to make wholesome relationships between men and women increasingly difficult.
Thanks for your talk, Jo. I was feeling like some of the things you were saying about victimhood were kind of contradictory. Like you commended the bravery of the gymnasts who came forward and took their perpetrator to court, but also you're kind of stigmatizing people who come forward and say they're victims in other areas. And I just wanted to stress how difficult it is to come forward and speak about experiences that are traumatic, and that a lot of people don't have that option to achieve justice in the justice system. It's notoriously difficult to even get a case to court and listen. And then even if you do get to court, if somebody is found innocent, then that's then directed towards the accuser as if they've lied and brought the case forward as some kind of like spiteful situation. So I'd just like to hear what you think about that, and whether you think that there are some negatives and dangers to stigmatising victimhood.
Yes, I'm sorry that you seem to be in denial about the issue of FGM, but if I can give another example, it is a well ascertained fact that in Islam it takes, speaking about courts, this lady was speaking about courts, in Islam it takes the 2 women to equal the testimony of a man, and there are also many other dreadful things that, you know, if a woman is raped, she's considered to be the guilty party unless she can get several men to witness and state that she was raped. So quite clearly, what I'm talking about, another patriarchy. I don't know if I said the patriarchy. I might have used that term incorrectly, but there are patriarchies, and Islam is a patriarchy which is far worse. Those examples I've just given in the law. And yet nobody talks about these things. They complain about all the sorts of little peccadillos that women have to put up. But surely legal rights of being half of the value of a man, or having it being the case that underage children can be married in Islam. So I think this is an issue which is simply being ignored by feminism.
Islam's as diverse as Christianity. You can't just say there's this one version of Islam.
Sorry, this was the person.
Sorry, but
I'd just like to observe that I think there's plenty of points of agreement between you two, specifically about social class, and that I think that there are ways in which feminism might sort of tackle this in terms of redirecting the arguments about pay gaps, which is between the top and the bottom. And for example, we really ought to be demanding a care economy rather than the absurd spectacle economy, or paying only those people who make money but don't necessarily earn money.
Asked to be brief.
Yes, I'd just like to draw people's attention to the Women's Budget Group, which you might like to look up on the website, on its website, and see how it's working towards the benefits of women. It's the Women's Budget Group.
Going back to the first question, somebody asked if it's good that women have now have a platform and they are empowered, and I agree that it is good that women can now speak out, and if the Savile victims had been able to speak out, that would obviously have been good. And it is, I think, still brave, because some people might be beyond slut shaming, but other people are not, and it is for many people very difficult to talk about what they talk about. Can't read what I've written now. Somebody asked if modern feminism is damaging relationships between women and men and making wholesome relationships impossible. Well, of course, in the past, not all relationships have been wholesome at all. Very many relationships have not been what we would certainly today see as wholesome. And I don't think that many of the women I know, including myself, are in a good relationship with a man, and they don't have a problem with it. Some men do have a problem, but many don't. And younger men some younger men have a lot less problem than some older men, but there are still problems amongst some younger men. Islam and patriarchy is a political hot potato, which is very difficult in some areas to talk about, and it's a pity there aren't. Some feminists I know are working, white non-Islamic feminists are working with Islamic women in empowering them in various ways. And that's what some feminists are doing. The media doesn't take up that kind of story, but that is going on.
It's not really answering my question. It's in Africa, its culture is not related to Islam.
It's not. Of course, it's not the whole of Islam.
And we have 99% of us Islam. Not me, I'm not. But we don't have at all this. We don't have it at all. But we can find it in Egypt. And we can find it in any place in Africa. So it's the culture. It's not related to the
religion. Yes, absolutely. Sorry, I should have said that.
We don't have a lot of time left though. Just let
let
Valerie finish.
There's been so many different questions. Right, I'll end with one of the last questions, which was about the care economy. And I certainly think we should move to a care economy, which would be a woman-centred economy in many ways, which would benefit men as well as women. It would be less individualistic, it would be more socialist, and it would look at class, it would look at race, it would look at other divisions and the way in which these, to use a word that's been much criticised, intersect with gender. You'll never solve gender inequalities and oppressions if you treat gender in isolation from other forms of inequality.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, very, very quickly, I do think there is far too much feminist deference to Islam today. And I think you see examples of Swedish government ministers, for example, going on trips to Saudi Arabia, donning headscarves. I don't think there's anything progressive or anything to be celebrated in that. And I think feminists should be far more supportive of women in Iran, for example, who were protesting by removing their headscarves. I know I've dealt with that incredibly briefly, but I don't want to be distracted. It's not the major point of my book, and my book is focusing on what's going on with women in this country. I know increasingly there are Muslim populations in this country, but it's not a major topic I've dealt with, so I am just going to keep brief on that. I think there is too much feminist deference to Islam. Coming back to some of the other points that were raised, of course, a woman who was saying, would I be celebrating the fact that there is zero pay gap for people on minimum wage? Well, I absolutely hope that didn't come across in my opening remarks. I think, it's shocking the number of jobs which are at minimum wage level. The point I was trying to make, and probably making quite badly, is that the fact that there is zero gender pay gap for people on the minimum wage exposes to me how ridiculous the whole nature of the gender pay gap discussion is, because it's not a helpful way of making sense of the wages that are paid to people on the minimum wage. If we focus our understanding on gender rather than on social class, we can tick that box. We can say, yay, let's celebrate, there's zero gender pay gap here. Whereas instead, if we focus more on social class rather than gender, if we say, look, men and women on the minimum wage, you've got more in common with each other rather than you have against each other, then we can begin to move forward and look at how we fight for higher wages for everyone. I think the problem with the gender pay gap discussion is it becomes incredibly misleading. The fact is that men and women doing the same job, working for the same number of hours, with the same levels of experience, get paid the exact same amount. If they didn't, A, it would be against the law, and the companies could be taken to court, and B, it doesn't make any logical sense if a boss could get away with employing a woman to do the exact same job as a man and pay her substantially less. Why would anyone employ a man? I mean, it just wouldn't make any economic or financial sense whatsoever. I think the problem with the discussion around the gender pay gap is it gives young women about to enter the labour market today, just leaving university, this real false sense of how hard things are going to be for them. So throwing around statements like it's going to take 120 years for the gender pay gap to close tells young women, don't even bother trying. You know, why make an effort to get on the career ladder, to get a good job if you're still just going to be permanently disadvantaged? To come back to the Harvey Weinstein, the sexual abuse, why are these women taking their stories to the media? You know, I think there definitely was, and again, you know, I'm not naive, there definitely was a time when women were not believed, when women took rape allegations, allegations of sexual assault, of sexual abuse, when children took accusations of sexual abuse to police, to courts, and were not believed, were routinely not believed. And that was appalling, it was terrible, not a time I would in any way want us to go back to. However, I find it equally as terrible if we start from the assumption that women should always be believed. I think that is equally as problematic. I'm a woman. I'm quite capable of telling lies. Lots of women I know are also quite capable of telling lies. The assumption that women should always be believed places women in the same category group as children. It's infantilizing. It's saying we're not quite adult, that we need to have this special status that doesn't see us as equal as men. And I think that's something that we need to fight against. So as to the question, what am I trying to achieve? Am I trying to just be deliberately controversial? Well, believe me, there's far easier ways. You know, if I was trying to make a living or attract attention to myself or something like that, there are far, far easier ways that I could do it than to deliberately criticise feminism. It certainly does not make me popular, and that's absolutely certain. But what I am trying to achieve is to not sit back and let what I see as being the major gains of feminism over the past 40, 50 years be overturned. I want to see women treated as equals to men, and that means believing that women can tell lies as well as tell the truth. It means recognising the gains that women have made. I also want to see women's freedom being recognised, being considered important, and that means freedom to be able to take risks. I do not want adverts to be banned in my name. I do not want skinny models to be taken off catwalks in order to protect me. Also, I don't want young women to grow up thinking that they're going to be more disadvantaged than they actually are, because I think that holds women back. It tells women not to bother. It tells women that the world's against them, that there's a conspiracy. So I have 2 sons and a daughter. Statistically, my daughter is far more likely to go to university than my boys. Statistically, my daughter is far more likely to land a top job than my boys are today. Now those are just facts, and I think it's important that my daughter knows that, and I don't want her, she's only 12 at the moment, I don't want her growing up thinking that the world is against her when it's not. I want her to grow up enjoying freedom, enjoying the freedom to take risks, enjoying spontaneous, unprompted interactions with people. I want her to have the freedom to be able to do whatever she wants in life, and I don't want feminism to give her false messages about how disadvantaged she is, about how much of a victim she's going to end up, and what a terrible life she's going to have. I can't think of anything more tragic, and that's what motivates me on a day-by-day basis.
Thank you very much.